This is Paul Schneider today on the 118th edition of the Sports Untold podcast, also on Rainier Avenue Radio. My special guest today is Seth Everett. Seth is an American sports host, columnist, and sports commentator. Seth, I'll get back to you in a minute, I promise. My podcast is also now on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Amazon, Google, iTunes, Podbean, and you can go to sportsuntoldpodcast.com. We're live on Facebook Live today, and this interview will also be there'll also be an audio version of this interview. I encourage my listeners to like, comment, and subscribe, and go to my show website, as I just mentioned, sportsuntoldpodcast.com. Seth, let me give you a little more of an introduction to the listeners today. Seth Everett's been a sports commentator, columnist, reporter, and host, I believe, for over a quarter century now in the sports world. Seth, please let me know if I state your background. I state your background properly. I don't want to bungle it at all. I had one guest where I did not state the person's background properly, and I learned a lesson there. So make sure I got this right. Seth hosts 3 podcasts that have over 100,000 listeners weekly. Seth has worked for ESPN, Fox Sports Radio, and other stations and networks. He's also worked as an adjunct professor at Syracuse University, good school. For many people in the Northwest, this is a Seattle-based show, although we're trying to do some national interviews. Many people remember Seth when he was a host and reporter at Seattle's KGR AM 950 radio. Now KGR is known as FM 93.3 KGR. And Seth, I have a little line for you, probably never heard before. We can add you to the famous list of people who have lived in Seattle. You and Ray Charles have that in common. You both had Seattle stops, so we can put you in with Ray Charles. I had to throw that in there. Seth's podcasts, I believe, are Sports with Friends, Hall of Justice, and Tech Stream with Shelley Palmer. Seth, I really appreciate you coming on the Sports Untold podcast, also on Rainier Avenue Radio. And did I get most of the introduction stated accurately?
Yeah, no, you did. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, Jason Barrett and I wrote a column on sports media for a while, but it just conflicted. When they needed the column, I couldn't write it. So we had a mutual parting of the ways. But other than that, I still do my podcast. I broadcast with iHeartMedia right now. I do a lot of stuff with them. So that's kind of my day job. And the podcasts are kind of my side hustle.
Seth, I'm going to start with probably a question you did not anticipate today. We talk on all sorts of stuff on Sports Untold. Pickleball is the fastest growing sport in America. Sports Illustrated just had a story about pickleball and its growth. Founded in Bainbridge Island, Washington, as you probably know, it's across the sound from Seattle. Should the mainstream sports media cover pickleball more on the phenomenon that is going on right now with the sport?
The phenomenon seems to be in the playing of it, not the watching of it. And given the metrics that you can see with streaming, if you're looking for pickleball, you'll find it. And if enough people are finding it, when you say, should the media, if you're talking about linear media, linear media is crumbling before our very eyes. So what has transpired in media is it's really a la carte. You can watch anything you really want to in today's day and age. So whether it's pickleball, whether it's rugby, I'm a big, last year I'm a big Premier League supporter. Mm-hmm. And it was very easy and rather inexpensive. And I get all the games, come on my phone. They tell me when they're playing, and, living on the East Coast, those games are usually 7:30 in the morning. It's perfect. It's been phenomenal. So, pickleball or anything else, it's really what has happened is people will find whatever they want.
Gotcha. I see there's a pickleball Hall of Fame now, and it's getting a little more recognition, but
maybe they'll have a better voting process.
Maybe better than the Baseball Hall of Fame voting process. Right. Maybe there won't be a character clause, which seems to screw everything up. Right. Okay, well, anyhow, I thought I'd start with a little off-the-wall question on pickleball, but it's growing as a sport, and I wanted to kind of get your take. Seth, you have 3 podcasts. Take a minute and tell us about your 3 podcasts that are going on with you right now.
Oh, wow, now you're talking about me. It's like talking about my children. Sports with Friends was something that came out. I got involved in podcasting a long time ago. I don't take credit for coming up with the idea, but Major League Baseball deserves a lot of the credit. I was working for Major League Baseball, and they were developing MLB.com at the time, And one of the things they were doing is I had a radio show with the late, great Darrell Hamilton, who's a former baseball player, who was my best friend. And they wanted to help market our radio show by taking 30 to 40 minutes of it, making it an MP3 for this hot new device called the iPod. And I remember MLB actually met with Apple about how to make these MP3s accessible. This is all before we ever heard the word podcast. So podcasting was something that was very, very near and dear to my heart. When I was at ESPN, I did a podcast called Baseball Today. And then in 2015, fast forwarding now 20 years, I wanted to create my own podcast. And originally it was going to be called From the Press Box. I was going to interview a bunch of writers. And then Darrell and I started talking about it, and we were going to try to recreate our old radio show. And by doing that, we were going to just change the podcast to, what our radio show was called. And then in June of 2015, he was tragically killed.
So sorry.
And when that happened, I was going to give it up, and people were pushing me and said, hey, you've been doing podcasting a long time. You should really have your own. And I said, I only want to talk to my friends. And so the story goes is that my mother at the time was obsessed with the iPhone game Words with Friends. And so that's how I came up with Sports with Friends. And the original concept was I would just talk to my friends, because that was healing to me. It was a great way to properly mourn the loss of my friend. And then what happened is it kind of evolved into, a lot of PR guys are my friends, and they were constantly pitching their clients, and it's gone on. We just finished, we just released our 358th episode, and Eli Manning's been on 5 times. Martin Brodeur has been on twice. No, Martin Brodeur has been on once. Ken Griffey Jr. has been on twice. And we'll put broadcasters, writers, athletes, former athletes. We've had over a half a dozen Hall of Famers on the podcast, and it's a lot of fun. And then Hall of Justice was a very different thing. I come from a sports radio background, and in the 90s, before I got to Seattle, I remember being told that superheroes were never something men could talk about. And I had that idea. And then in 2015, the same year I created Sports with Friends, I had a freelance job where I was moderating at a bunch of Comic-Cons.
Okay.
I was hosting things at Comic-Cons. And what I found was, it's the superhero genre, but there's a lot of adults that are artists and writers and actors and directors and all these interesting people with stories to tell and no platform to tell them. So the idea behind the Hall of Justice was the slogan is, if you're old enough to know what the Hall of Justice is, you're our demographic. And it's really just for grownups. That was the whole concept of it. I just thought it was something that has been really, really remarkable. We've had some really big guests: Ben Affleck, Samuel L. Jackson, Kevin Smith's been on it. Just some really neat people. And also we do reviews. I have like a stable of like 5 or 6 really good industry friends who help me with the reviews. So when a movie comes out, when Thor comes out in a couple of weeks, we'll review it on the podcast. And we just do that for Star Wars and all stuff in the genre. But we treat it seriously. And, the concept is, if you treat it with the same gravitas and passion that you treated sports radio, then people would gravitate toward it. And that's happened. We've seen that, with the download numbers and such like that. So it's been a labor of love. It's a huge passion. Tech Stream is something I started with this guy, great guy, Shelley Palmer. He's a tech expert. And over COVID, I got to know Shelley a little bit. And what I realized was that the types of tech podcasts that were out there were either super nerdy, like super high tech, or like for dummies. And I said, there's got to be something in between. And so that was the idea. And, we've tackled some pretty interesting things. This week, we did an episode on Congress is trying to take down TikTok. Why? That kind of thing, and stuff like that. So TechStream is it's been really fun. It's newer, so it doesn't have the same audience that the other two shows. The other two shows are going up on 8 years old, and so they kind of have a following that TechStream hopefully will get one day.
You're a real podcast veteran, Seth. And I love the name of your show, Hall of Justice. It sounds like a legal podcast kind of. So it's
well, it's very funny that the whole idea, I have a lot of history with Prince, and the whole idea I thought was, when I named it the Hall of Justice, for your listeners that don't know, the Hall of Justice was the building where the Super Friends hung out in the 1970s.
Right. Okay.
And DC owns that name. And so I always thought that if the podcast ever had an audience, we would get a cease and desist. And what's really funny that has happened, in 2016, Zack Snyder came on and he was directing Batman, Superman. DC people started following me on Twitter, and they know about the Hall of Justice, and no one has stopped me. And I have a logo, I have artwork that calls the show the podcast formerly known as. Like that's the Prince connection. So it was going to be the podcast formerly known as Hall of Justice. We were going to do that. We were ready to go. And it's just, we're up at, we've done almost 300 episodes and nobody said a word. And Warner Brothers helps me get guests, and they're hysterical because they don't pay me to do it and I don't pay them.
It's all working out. My producer, Lucius, has a good question. He wants to know if you can define what linear media is. Good question.
Linear media is the traditional radio and television. That's been labeled linear media. It's cable, it's FM and AM, those kinds of things. Digital media is more streaming and podcasts and things like that. I've kind of transitioned out of, I still do work with iHeart, but even the stuff that I do with iHeart is more of a digital nature, where you're submitting things to a server as opposed to, going live and taking calls and things like that. It's just, to me, the spoken word is far from suffering. I think the spoken word is growing exponentially. I think traditional radio is falling apart, and I wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for that.
Gotcha. Well, you definitely have some interesting things going. And I think it's neat, Seth, that although you're known as a sports guy, you're obviously branching out into other subjects as well. So it's
thanks. I was always interested in all these things. It was just a matter of being able to talk about it in my job. And it's very funny because when I was at KJR, the first Star Wars prequel came out, and I was there at Cinerama in downtown Seattle, like waiting for it, with Softy, and the two of us were sitting there like total idiots. I just remember back then saying, we never talked about it on the radio. We know that was such a great experience. And the fact, and I don't have an ego. I'm not bragging about numbers, but the fact that thousands of people listen to a podcast where I'll review Obi-Wan Kenobi is pretty stinking amazing. It's pretty remarkable. And the fact that anyone advertises on those shows makes me crack up, because I would do those shows for free.
Fun stuff. This is Paul Schneiderman, host of the Sports Untold podcast, also on Rainier Avenue Radio, with media veteran Seth Everett. And I encourage my listeners to like, comment, subscribe, and go to sportsuntoldpodcast.com. Seth, you mentioned your friendship with the late Darrell Hamilton, and I've been following you on Facebook for years, and I follow you on Twitter. So sorry to hear about his passing. Can you share a little bit more about Darrell and your friendship with Darrell Hamilton?
Well, Darrell played in the big leagues, and I started covering baseball in 1996. He was just a good interview. I mean, that's how I knew him. He was unceremoniously cut by the Mets in 2001. And by 2003, a friend of his tried to get him involved with MLB Radio. I had been doing a show at MLB Radio, and then they partnered us up. We just hit it off. he's a guy, we're polar opposites. I'm a Jewish kid from New Jersey, and he's a 6'4", Southern Baptist from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We couldn't have been more different, but we got each other. We got our humor. We had, I could do your whole episode just telling Daryl stories.
Sure,
they're just hysterical. And we had a great time. And then the league, Bud Selig, caught our show and offered Daryl a position in baseball operations. And that's the only reason why our show ever ended. And we got to know each other differently after the show was over. And I thought our friendship got better after we stopped working together, really. And then in 2014, the year before he died, which I didn't know, he got a job traveling with the Brewers. And I was traveling with the Mets. And so we were crisscrossing all through the country. And so we would text each other every day, where are you today? What are you doing today? And, what are you seeing? What are you doing? And it was so strange because we were literally talking every day. Every day. I didn't go to the ballpark without a conversation with him. And then, for it all to change, he died on Father's Day. And ironically, I was in the air and I had stopped. You know how I had a stopover? I was in Sacramento, California that morning because of that Comic-Con job. And I was in Houston for a 2-hour layover. And I thought about calling him, but it was Father's Day, so he should be with his kids. Sure. I like that. That's what you do. And it's, with technology the way it is, just because I'm in Houston doesn't mean he can come see me. You know what I mean? Like there was no reason to. And it turns out, when we got the police report, that was the exact time he was killed. I was in Houston when it happened. Ironically, I was recording an episode of Sports with Friends. It was it wasn't called Sports with Friends at the time. It was the Press Box show. I was interviewing a columnist who wrote an article about Alex Rodriguez, who I can't stand. And he hates me just as much. Yeah, he and I have pretty long history, starting back from our days in Seattle. And she wrote a column about him hitting well and how this is a big reclamation project for him. And I said, well, can you curse on this podcast?
Sure.
Okay. So my point of having this woman on was just because he's hitting a baseball doesn't make him any less an asshole. And that was the podcast. And the funny part about it is we were 3/4 of the way through the episode when I started seeing something on Twitter. I saw sad day for Mets fans. The Brewers tweeted something weird. I was like, what's going on? And then MLB Network called me because he was supposed to be on MLB Network that morning. We had actually had plans that Wednesday, and he died on a Sunday. And it was just, it was a life-changing event. It was not something I don't think I've still recovered from it. And, I think about him every day, and, I try to carry on. He would be a little disheartened by what's going on in our country. We don't need to talk about that, but he would. And it's just funny the way life goes. But to be able to talk about him, it just it's so much fun, and everybody who hears about him wishes they met him. And that's what.
Oh my gosh, just hearing these stories, he seems like a real mensch, and I wish I knew him. But thank you for sharing about a little more Daryl. And I could definitely talk to him about throughout the whole show, but I do want to hit other topics. But thanks for sharing. It's always kind of tough, Seth, when you do a show or a podcast to transition from a topic like about a passing to another topic. But bear with me as I do that. The Supreme Court made a major ruling recently in that Joe Kennedy school prayer case. And it's definitely a constitutional law story, but it's also a sports story. Sports Illustrated just did a story on it. So there is a high school sports angle. Feel free to comment on the Supreme Court decision, but in general, what do you think, Seth, as someone who's been covering sports for so many decades, just about prayer sessions in general in high school sports environments. Give me your thoughts on that. I know a lot of my friends and people I know have totally different opinions in the case, but give me your thoughts on it.
Wow. Honestly, I think it has no place in it. I think that, prayer is something between a person and their whatever God they believe in. And I think that religion is something I have great respect for, and know many religious people of different religions, but I don't think it should cross over. And I think that religion should have no bearing on anything in public. And I just don't think it's right. And I thought the court really botched one.
Well, what one thought I want to add on.
It wasn't the worst thing they'd done that week. How about that?
Well, I understand. I think we're probably coming out similar on some of these recent Supreme Court decisions. But, one thing about that situation is I think in life, Seth, sometimes you have to apply the shoe on the other foot test. And I just wonder how some people would react who are very supportive of Coach Kennedy's prayers if it had been a Hindu prayer or a Muslim prayer or a Jewish prayer, or what if it had been a secular humanist gathering? What if there's an assistant coach that wants to get players together and promote an atheist message? I don't know. I just think this is opening up some doors. That's
what I'm saying. I think it has no place, and it shouldn't matter what religion it is. I'm not anti-Catholic. I'm not anti-Christian. I'm not anti-Muslim. I'm not anti-anything. And I respect people's beliefs. I think that a lot of religion has led to a lot of radicalism, and that always alarms me. And so I like to keep it separate. I like to, I don't think it belongs. I will tell you, just to make it more of a sports story, I find Tim Tebow to be a fraud, and he's probably the biggest example of somebody who uses religion to gain a following. This was a guy who 6 or 7 years ago tried to speak at a church in Texas that was notably anti-Black, anti-gay, and anti-Jewish. And when I heard that, I became anti-Tebow. And he never spoke at the church because people realized what a backlash he would get. But that just shows you that it's not about the religion; it's more about the image, and it's fraudulent. And the fact that teams have signed him, I thought the New York Mets were shameless when they signed him because they knew he had a following. I thought that was a joke. I think he's on television because he had a following that is religious based. I think it's wrong. And so this is again, if it's important to have religion as part of sports, then your result is going to be Tim Tebow.
Wow, lot there. I wasn't aware of that Tim Tebow story. Lot there. But anyway, I want to hit on that joke.
He's on a list of guys that I would never put on my podcast. I would if Tim Tebow was sitting next to me right now, I don't want to hear what he has to say. I don't respect what he says.
You wouldn't want to just hear his point of view on your show. Nope. You would not. Wow. Okay. You have kind of a cancel culture view of Tim Tebow.
No, it's not. It's not that. It's not that. I saw enough of what he was trying to do. And I'm not saying he can't be on anywhere he wants. It's just my choice not to watch. That's not cancel culture. Please, Paul, understand. That's not cancel culture. What I talked about earlier is the a la carte nature in which you can consume sports. Well, I can choose not to watch. I don't watch the NFL pregame shows. Doesn't mean they're canceled.
Fair enough. I understand. Fair enough. I just wanted to expand on your thoughts on Tebow a bit. I've asked these two questions to many guests, and I get great answers. Who is a living sports figure that you would love to interview? It could be a commissioner, a player, somebody in the sports world. And who's a deceased sports figure in history you would love to have chatted with or interviewed?
That I haven't? You mean that I haven't?
Yeah, you can add someone. You can mention someone you've chatted with, but feel free to mention a living sports figure you have not chatted with that you'd love to chat with.
A living sports figure that I have not interviewed that I would like to.
I know you're not going to answer Tim Tebow that question. So
no. Nor would I. I'm trying to think. Who have I not interviewed? I never sat down and did a proper interview with Ichiro Suzuki. I've covered him from a distance, but when I was covering him, it was the beginning of his career, and his English was pretty bad. And a couple of my good buddies, Mike Cameron, once told me what a great guy he was. And so I would, just off the top of my head, I would think Ichiro, I would love to sit down and just talk shop with him. And that would be great to have him on the podcast. It's funny. I see your background there. Probably if there was a sports athlete that's deceased that I would want to talk to, it would be Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig was a very influential person in my early life. My grandfather died when he was, boy, a lot of death on this episode. But my grandfather died when I was young, and when I was 13 years old, and he had Lou Gehrig's disease. And so when I was young, I researched a lot of what he was and what he stood for. I saw the movie Pride of the Yankees. I was a Yankee fan when I grew up, not anymore. But Lou Gehrig was very consequential. When I played freshman year, I played high school baseball. I was number 4. I played first base. So Lou Gehrig was a big part. I'm trying to think of dead people that I've interviewed, that I would want to interview that I hadn't. Probably him.
You're the first person to mention Ichiro Suzuki as a living sports figure you'd love to chat with. Great answer. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame one day.
Yeah. And
you're actually the first guest, Seth, who's answered Lou Gehrig.
Oh, really?
So those are, it's always fun to get a couple of new answers. And Lou Gehrig would be high on my list. Jackie Robinson would be high on my list, Hank Greenberg, some of these deceased baseball players, and some of the Negro League baseball players would be fascinating to chat with. So
I'll tell you a funny story. I interviewed Yogi Berra once.
Oh, wow.
And somebody played a trick on me and got them all riled up. And they knew it would get them all riled up. There's a great play in the 1955 World Series where Jackie Robinson's trying to score from home, and he's tagged out by Yogi Berra, and he was called safe. And I knew that, but that's before my time. I wasn't alive at that time. It's part of history. I've read my history. We were at Yankee Stadium. I was working for Major League Baseball, and our task that day was to get a bunch of players to talk about the significance of Jackie Robinson Day. That's April 15th. They make Jackie Robinson Day. And so we interviewed, dozen players, 6 on each side. And Yogi Berra was sitting in the dugout, and this guy, Steve, he totally set me up. And he says, why don't you interview Yogi Berra? I was like, Yogi Berra, an icon. And he says, yeah, I'll introduce you. I'll set it up, get the camera ready, and just ask him the significance of Jackie Robinson Day. And I said, excuse me, Mr. Berra, do you mind if we talk to you for a moment? And he, sure. He sits me down. I sit right next to him. And I said, so tell me about the significance. What comes to mind when Jackie Robinson comes up? And Yogi Berra, in his advanced age, starts screaming at the top of his lungs, he was out. I tell you, I tagged that mother, blah, blah, blah. And he's screaming at me. And my friend Steve was like, yeah, I'd interviewed Yogi Berra before. I knew he was going to do that. So he totally set me up. And that's one of my favorite, like, all-time icons. That the other one is Tommy Lasorda called me a communist. Daryl and I were in Japan, and we were calling play-by-play of the first round of the World Baseball Classic.
Uh-huh.
We were in Tokyo, Japan, and I had a very strict opinion about the World Baseball Classic. I thought it was played at the wrong time of year. Playing it in March before a 162-game season was stupid. And if it was important enough because of the international competition of it, play it in October or November. And playing it in March, and I didn't know this, but Tommy Lasorda was an ambassador for the whole thing, and he was standing behind me. And I'm saying to Daryl, if I am a general manager of any team, I would not let my pitchers pitch in this thing. Well, Tommy Lasorda puts the headset on. I don't know that he's heard me. We go to commercial. It's the half inning. We welcome in former Dodger manager Tommy Lasorda, and he started screaming. He says, you're an insult to your country. He said, you're a communist. He called me a communist.
Wow.
And Daryl was cracking up. And I couldn't believe it. And fast forward 3 years, we were at the winter meetings in, I want to say Orlando or Nashville, one of the places where they hold the winter meetings. And I was actually doing a stage show, and Griffey was with me. And we were sitting there, taking questions from the crowd, whatever. And somebody brought up the World Baseball Classic. And we said the same thing, the pitchers, it's all about the pitchers. And Griffey was totally understanding what I was saying. And all of a sudden we heard this scream come from the back of the audience. It was Tommy Lasorda screaming at me again. So when he passed, we did a tribute podcast to him on Sports with Friends, but we told that story.
You got Tommy going, Seth. Paul Steinberg hosts the Sports Untold podcast also on Rainier Avenue Radio with Seth Everett. Tommy Lasorda was a character. He was, everything I read, he was known to have some strong opinions.
He was nuts. He was certifiably nuts.
Certifiably. I have kind of a quick, cute Yogi Berra story. I'll make it short. So there was a federal judge who died last year I was friendly with, kind of Wally McGovern. He died at 99 years old last year. And I used to see Wally at my athletic club. And back in 2015, I said, Judge, did you see Yogi Berra just turned 90? And McGovern was about 93 at the time. He goes, he's just a kid. So I always thought that was kind of cute that McGovern, 3 years older than Yogi Berra, said that when Yogi turned 90. I had a guest when I asked that question of who is a living sports figure you love to chat with. And KJR guy, Chuck Powell, great host. And Chuck actually answered one name he threw out was Kevin Costner. He thought that Costner's sports movies are so fascinating, and he thought that Costner would be an interesting sports figure that he'd like to chat with. I got a question for you, and this in my little circles of friends, this became a little chat. Can you define a guy like Kevin Costner, an actor, as a sports related figure? What do you think of that?
What do you mean? I'm not sure what you're saying.
Do you think it'd be fair to put Kevin Costner, define him as a sports related figure because he's been in so many sports movies? But
he's been in other movies too.
True.
I mean, he's an actor. He's just an actor. That's like saying Wesley Snipes is only known as Willie Mays Hayes from Major League. These guys are actors. I think that's great. I remember when I had a chance to interview Ben Affleck for the Hall of Justice, and he had been in a basketball movie called the No Way Out, or it was a basketball movie that came out in 2020 where he was a basketball coach.
Right.
And when I got there, the PR person said, the only thing you can talk about is the basketball movie. And I said, guy's Batman. Like, what are we talking about here? And so we did this interview, and I wound up putting it on Sports with Friends because it was a basketball interview, not a superhero interview. And it was very funny that Ben Affleck, of all people, like I would have wanted to talk to him about Argo and all these other great movies, but it was just the sports thing. So I don't know. I just Kevin Costner. I'm trying to think. Kevin Costner, did one of those celebrity softball games at the All-Star game. I think I interviewed him there.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I don't recall.
Oh yeah, I was just curious if you think he's defined as a sports related figure because he's been in Field of Dreams, some of those movies. But anyhow, I just want to get your take. Yeah. All right, so big news here. You can accuse me of a West Coast bias today, Seth, but big news that USC and UCLA announced are going to be defecting from the Pac-12 and heading to the Big Ten. Is this story going to go down as one of the biggest sports stories of 2022? And will this go down as one of the biggest sports stories of the decade, USC and UCLA leaving the Pac-12?
Well, it's a massive story, and it's really a sports media story. What you're seeing is another change in the landscape. And what it's going to turn into is it's going to turn into these two mega conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, and they're going to get the top dollar for their television rights. And then there's going to be a second tier. And I just think that what's turning out is unfortunate because on any given year, somebody from the I'm not naive. I know the ACC, for example, is not as big as the SEC. I know that, right? But on any given year, a great team can make the college football. Cincinnati can make the college football playoff. Well, now everybody's going to want to play in those super conferences. And so it's going to kill the recruiting possibilities for all the outside tiers. So the Pac-12, the Big 12, the ACC, they're all going to become like the second tier. I actually proposed on a radio show this morning that they should make it like the Premier League out in England and say that the teams that finish in last place should get sent down to the second tier. Could you imagine if North Carolina, wins the ACC championship and then go to the SEC for a year, and just the idea that you're really going to have the haves and the have-nots. If, from a Seattle perspective, if you're Washington, find some way to get the Big Ten to take you. Oregon, the same, but think about a team like Washington State. I did their pre and post game one year back in 1999, I think. They're going to be left in the dust. My alma mater, Syracuse, is going to get left in the back. And I think it just goes to show you the other lesson that's learned is how small basketball is compared to football. There's rumors that Clemson is going to pay all the fines, that the SEC is going to pay all the fines for Clemson to get out of the ACC. And no one's talking about Duke and North Carolina. And so if you think about that structure of where the super conferences are, Duke and North Carolina are not going to be able to recruit the same way they could because they're not going to be on television in the same way. If Apple makes this big play for the Big Ten rights, and that, goes, gives them money upon money, you're going to have the Big Ten, the SEC, and everybody else. And I think that's really sad. I think that the transfer portal, there's always over 1,000 players in the transfer portal right now. I think college sports are falling apart, honestly. I don't have a problem with the name, image, and likeness. It doesn't bother me. I never, I'm not standing in their way of potential earning, but I don't think that's the ruination. I think the ruination is there's no loyalty, because if a player, if a kid falls in love with a wide receiver on the Washington Huskies and he doesn't like the coach, he can just go to the transfer portal and take off. And that's ridiculous. There's no value there. And so I think that all the UCLA and USC story is the first domino to fall. But I think this is going to get a lot uglier before it's over.
Big story this decade, then.
Oh, it's going to be a massive story. And it's not, it's very funny because I'm tempted to do next week's Sports with Friends on it. But then I'm like, is it going to be dated in 2 weeks? It's some seismic shift. And, it's kind of the,
Seth, you brought up a lot there. And one thing you brought up is absolutely fascinating that I hadn't thought of, that maybe an American sports league could incorporate more of a European style.
I would love it. That's just me spitballing. I mean, but I think I haven't heard that. That would be a fantastic thing. For those of you who don't know, there's the Premier League, which is the top league in European in English football. And in England itself, there is something called the Champions League, which is like their AAA. And every year, the top three teams who win in the Championship League, their reward is they're now in the Premier League. And the bottom three teams, they get sent down. They're relegated to the lower league. And I think it's fascinating because as I said, I watched the Premier League very intently. The games, they were games where the teams were fighting for their Premier League lives.
Right.
Could you imagine in the NFL, just use the NFL as an example, the Jacksonville Jaguars having a massive game in week 17? They need it or else they're sent down to the minors. Well, think about that in college football, and just the idea that you'd want to make sure that your program wins is at all costs just to make sure that you stay in the SEC or the Big Ten. I would love it. I think it would be amazing for college sports.
It'd be very unique if a major American league at the college or pro levels.
Well, it could only happen in college because players unions wouldn't allow it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it can only happen in college. And if you're going to restructure the whole thing, well, do it well.
Absolutely interesting idea. You mentioned Softy, who I know too. He was on my show
Good.
a couple years ago, great guy. And Softy said something on his show that I didn't hear. It was mentioned to me, Seth. Softy suggests, I don't know if this is Dave's opinion, but he suggests that Washington should consider going independent and not join a conference. Softy threw out that idea. Apparently, what do you think?
No, I think what's going to happen, the only difference is there's a chance that there's 3 super conferences, and that's if Notre Dame goes to the ACC. But for my money, I think Notre Dame has to make a decision. And, it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning with linear television. Right now, Notre Dame gets money from NBC. And if they were to go to the Big Ten, I heard this morning, what if they offer up that their home games remain on NBC, but that their road games go to whatever conference they go to? And if I was Notre Dame, now I don't understand Notre Dame. I don't understand the allure of Notre Dame. It goes back to the whole religion thing. I don't get it. I don't have a problem with it. I don't have a bias against it. It's not my thing. But if I was Notre Dame, I would go to the Big Ten, because if you go to the Big Ten, now you're in this mega conference. And I think that there's value there. Having said that, that crushes the ACC. If Notre Dame takes Notre Dame football and puts it in the ACC, so you have Clemson and Notre Dame in one conference, that gives that conference a chance to get rights deals that are similar to what the Big Ten and the SEC has. As a Syracuse fan, that would be wonderful, because that means the ACC is a big player. But I don't see that happen. I don't see why Notre Dame would leave independent status to go to the ACC. I do see why they would go to the Big Ten. If I'm Washington, I go with Oregon and I say to the Big Ten, please take us. Because you don't want to get lost. I'm telling you, the city of Seattle, they love that program. And I respect the heck out of it. If they're going to do it, then do me a favor. Make sure that you get in one of these mega conferences, because if you don't, you're going to be one of the afterthoughts.
Could be a Washington, Oregon package. Now, I'm going to ask you something else. I had a guy on my show a couple of years ago.
I like how you tell me that you're going to ask me something.
Well, maybe it's a little habit.
You could, well, you tell me, you say, I'm going to ask you something. I know you're going to.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have our little quirks, I guess, with
I'm just trying to bust your chops.
Yeah, I deserve it. I can handle it. And I had a guy on my show. He's a professor at Smith College, a sports economist, and Andrew Zimbalist.
Oh,
and
sure.
Zimbalist is very interesting. And he has written in various books and articles, he believes that the NCAA is not a sustainable economic model. He believes it needs to be abolished, and he believes Congress needs to step in and start a new federally chartered college sports athletic organization. Are we getting closer to that happening at some point? What do you think of Zimbalist's idea?
Well, maybe. I think what has happened when the transfer portal was announced, I thought it was a COVID thing, and it was because some programs were treating COVID more seriously than others, and I think that was the genesis of it. What's changed is now that we're kind of past that, not that COVID's gone, but we're not letting it impact sports the way it did. I think that now this transfer portal has just changed everything. Growing up in the Northeast, college sports were never a big deal to me. When I got to college and learning what the Big East basketball was, I thought that was the best. And that was a lot of fun. As a Syracuse fan, I never cared that Syracuse went to the ACC, because the ACC doesn't mean anything to me. And, that's the funny thing is I'm fighting to argue for the preservation of a conference that I don't even like. And it's just funny how this realignment brings strange bedfellows. I think that college sports, I've never understood why some college sports exist, whereas other sports have minor leagues. Like there's minor league hockey and there's minor league baseball, but there's not minor league basketball. And now you're starting to see that with the evidence of the G League. And what I've thought is, and I've talked to some NBA people about this, is that, if this transfer portal really makes the college scene untenable, that I think that the G League will expand and that more players will just go straight to the G League. I think that'll happen, and that'll be the end of college basketball. Again, there's so much money in that tournament. Now, what I want to make sure there's a clear note here is that the tournament is valuable. The regular season is not. The regular season ratings have been hitting all-time lows, whereas the tournament has been hitting all-time highs. So it's really just that tournament that's keeping college basketball afloat.
What do you think, though, of the idea of just abolishing the NCAA and starting all over with a new organization?
Well, the NCAA to me is a paper thin group. There really isn't any. They don't have any real power. The power, and COVID showed you this. The power is in the conference, and so when you have these major conferences, the SEC is going to want to retain some level of its own control, as would the Big Ten. And if those are the two mega conferences, they'll run college sports the way they are. The NCAA does nothing, and I don't think any self-respecting fan of sports has any respect for what the NCAA is, because they don't defend players, they don't help players, they weren't looking out for players. They were letting the SEC throw these players when COVID was something we didn't know anything about, and they were threatening them with their scholarships, and the NCAA did nothing to protect them. If the NCAA had any spine, any power, they would have stepped in. And what I thought was shameless is how the Pac-12 stood their guns until they saw what everybody else did and said, nope, well, if they're doing it, we got to do it. And the ACC was even more shameless, because the ACC was set to cancel everything. And then all of a sudden the SEC said, well, we're playing hell or high water. We're playing. And the next thing you know, the ACC is like, oh, we're going to play too. We'll do whatever you guys do. And it's just like, again, there's no governing body. So, a lot of people would say the NCAA has already gotten that.
A lot there again. With the NCAA, I find it kind of interesting, Seth, putting on my legal hat for a second. It's taken courts to help clean up the NCAA. I don't think they've done a very good job regulating themselves. That's my 2 cents. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's just it's kind of a sham of an organization. It's just they haven't done anything.
Seth Everett tells it like it is. Not a whole lot of sugarcoating here for sure. Seth, you've covered a lot of teams. I think we covered the Sonics at one time. What was the most interesting team you covered in your career? Maybe not the best team, but the team that stood out for the most interesting characters or whatever.
Well, it was a time in my life when I was of a certain age where I related to players differently, and that's what made them interesting. I'll tell you 2 quick stories. The first one was the mid 90s, the Denver Broncos. I was their beat reporter, but I was on the radio, so I wasn't trying to get scoops or stories. I was just trying to, get sound and be on the air and know what was going on with the team. And I was really young. I was really shy, and I didn't know anybody. And if you watch the first 6 weeks of that football season, I didn't talk to anybody one-on-one. It was just scrums. I was really young and just starting. And then I remember the day. It was week 7 of my first year covering the Broncos, and I overheard a couple of players telling me that they played Madden football. And I walked over. I got some courage, and I went over them, and I said, "Did I hear you guys right? You guys play Madden football?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we love that game. We play online." I said, "Yeah, how do you play online?" And what you had to do back then was you had to dial one computer to contact the other computer, and they could play Madden football against each other. And I was like, I'd totally do that. And the next thing you know, fast forward the end of that season, we started a Madden football league with 8 players, a bunch of front office people, and a couple of media people. And we did it. And then that second year, the Broncos beat the Packers in Super Bowl 32. And if you look at that footage, you'll see a 24-year-old me, skinny little me, on the sideline. I was there when Terrell Davis had a migraine headache and he couldn't see, and Coach Shanahan put him in the game, and they said, "But Coach, I can't see." And he says, "That's okay. You're a decoy anyway." And they put him in, and John Elway ran in for the touchdown. And I was there. I was a big part of that. They actually invited me into their float for the parade. And
Love
so,
it.
from my personal standpoint, that was really interesting. The other example I would have to say is the 2000 Mariners, the team that won the wild card on the last day of the season, because it led to me leaving Seattle, and I didn't know that then. And you could argue that the existence of my children is because of one baseball game. There was the Sunday afternoon in Anaheim. The Mariners had it set up where if they won the wild card, and if they lost, they didn't. And I was in Anaheim with KJR, and I didn't have any dreams of leaving. I was, as a matter of fact, I was looking at apartments. My lease was up, and I was going to move. And they won that final game of the season. That was the first time I'd ever been in a champagne situation in baseball, and they won. They wound up going to play the White Sox in the playoffs, and I traveled with them. And then they wound up playing the Yankees in 2000. That's the year of the Subway Series, but that series between the Yankees and the Mariners, that's when Arthur Rhodes gave up the home run to David Justice. Darryl used to say there's no justice since Dave retired. And little did I know that I had met the people at Major League Baseball because I covered that series. They were all at that series. And we wound up having lunch, and I wound up doing an appearance on one of their shows. And little did we know that after that season ended, about 6 weeks later, I went back to New York for an interview to work for the league. And I'm convinced that I do not ever get that interview without, they would have no reason to interview me. I didn't even know there was a job without that game. So that win on that Sunday changed my life. And I didn't know it at the time. At the time, I thought it was just a fun party. And one little funny story is I was, not flying with the team. So I had to fly commercial, and I flew through Vegas, and my luggage stayed in Vegas. And I had changed my shirt because my shirt was drenched in champagne. I had changed my shirt, and I put on a Superman t-shirt. And when my luggage never arrived in Chicago, I had a windbreaker, and I zipped the windbreaker up all the way to cover up the Superman shirt. And I was so self-conscious, and I was in the team hotel. I remember coming down the escalator to go on the bus, and Arthur Rhodes looks right at me, and he just goes, "What the hell are you wearing?" I was so nervous.
Big Arthur Rhodes.
And another interesting nugget about that season is I was a witness to Alex Rodriguez buying gifts for all the receptionists in the office, in the front office, and he bought them all gifts, and because he was leaving, and he had made a deal in spring training that he wouldn't talk about his contract until the end of the season, wherever that ended. And so that night when they left, I rolled on about 30 minutes of Alex Rodriguez just BSing all his way through all this stuff about how he wanted to stay, and if he was going to leave, he would have to sign with a team that was rich in tradition and had a good farm system, all this nonsense. And ironically, I gave the tape to KJR. That was my job, so it was there. And then when I left from MLB, when I had started at Major League Baseball at that winter meetings when Alex signed with Texas. And when he did, KJR was playing the audio of my interview with him where he was saying all these lies. And that's when the whole thing started. So yeah, a lot of interesting things happened that year. That 2000 team, I know that everybody talks about the 2001 team, and I covered the 2001 team, but I did it from Major League Baseball. And because the Mariners were so good, and because I had just left, I went back like 6 times during the year. So I saw a boatload of their games, and I knew all the players and all those. John Halama was a dear friend of mine. Mike Cameron's a good friend of mine. Griffey, Griffey wasn't on that team, but just a bunch of great people. And the two most interesting teams were the 1997 Denver Broncos and the 2000 Seattle Mariners.
What those are just great team examples. You knocked the ball out of the park with your answer to that question. Those are just great ones. And we can't forget Ricky Henderson was a member of that 2000 Mariners team. So
yes, that's when the made up story happened, when Ricky Henderson told John Olerud that he played on the Mets with a guy who wore a helmet in the field. That was totally made up by the players. And it was reported by a lot of New York media that Ricky Henderson said to John Olerud, "Hey, I played with a guy with the Mets that wore a helmet in the field," and that totally never happened. Yeah, I do know a great Ricky Henderson story. When he was with the Padres, they were going on to the plane. When you're on a chartered plane, you go outside and you walk up the stairs. Right. You don't go through the airport. And a bunch of players went over. Ken Caminiti went over to Ricky Henderson and said, "Ricky, you get first dibs on the plane. You've got tenure." And Ricky Henderson looked at him and said, "Tenure? Ricky got 15 years."
I saw ESPN special 30 and 30 on Ricky Henderson when he went back and tried to play in the minor leagues like age 47 or something like that. Yeah. Interesting guy.
Well, I'm a big believer that in the media, it is never your position to take where you never can tell an athlete to retire. Unless you've done it, you can't tell an athlete to retire. So if an athlete wants to play until he's 65, that's his prerogative. What I don't like is when you retire and get all the accolades and then come back. Brett Favre, Roger Clemens, Brady, if you're going to retire, if you're going to go through the process of get the accolades and have us all praise you, then do me a favor, stay retired.
You got time for a couple more questions? I'll let you go.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm good.
Great,
I'm good.
Great. Favorite sports movie?
Favorite sports movie? The Natural.
That's
one of my top 5 movies of all time.
Great movie. I've actually mentioned that as one of my favorite sports movies, The Natural. I liked Hoop Dreams, We Are Marshall, all those different movies have come out. But Natural is a heck of a movie with Redford.
Great movie, yeah.
Great movie. I like the mystic side of it, and great one.
Yeah, sure.
That's really high on my list too. What's a question, Seth, you did not ask in an interview that you wish you asked? For some reason, you did not ask the question. You forgot, you got cold feet, or it doesn't like timing. What's a question you wish you would ask somebody that you didn't ask?
It's a really embarrassing story.
Not trying to embarrass you. I'm just curious.
I was in Italy.
You're laughing.
I was in Italy covering Formula E. It's electric car racing. It's something I'm really fascinated by. If your listeners can check it out, check out Formula E. It's the only sport that's going to actually change the world, because these teams are racking their brains trying to come up with these energy efficient cars, and that technology is going to be used to make our cars energy efficient. So that's how I got behind it. I actually interviewed Richard Branson for my podcast because of Formula E. So anyway, we were at Formula E, and they knew I had the Hall of Justice podcast. So the guys at Formula E say to me, "Hey, if we walk down towards the starting gate," because what Formula E does is they take city streets. So it's not like a track, it's nothing like NASCAR. And so they say, "Go to the corner over here. Let's go over there. Idris Elba is going to be there." And he says, "You can talk to him for your Hall of Justice podcast." Now, he was in all the Marvel movies. He was in Thor, and, he was in Avengers and all these movies. And the guy says, now he told you, he thinks you can only ask 2 questions. But Idris was so nice that I just started a conversation. Like I was casual with him, and I said, "How do you like Formula E?" And he said, "This is marvelous. This is so cool. Very cool." I said, Did you ride in a car?" And he's like, "Yeah, I rode in a car, and it was really awesome." And now I'm about to ask him, like, what was it like being in the Avengers? And the PR guy comes out of nowhere and says, "I told you 2 questions. He's got to go. Bye."
That's funny.
So I met Idris Elba and didn't ask him anything. I just chit-chatted with him for 2 minutes. I couldn't use it for anything. And it was such a dumb move. and I had him, but I didn't talk to him.
A little mix up there, but that's actually a very unique story of a question that you wish you asked, you didn't ask. Hey, tell us about your course at Syracuse University.
Oh, I teach a podcasting course, and what it is, there, I think the Newhouse School is doing what a lot of institutions are doing, is recognizing digital media. And they knew about the success of Sports with Friends and Hall of Justice. So they had reached out to me like 4 years ago and said, would you teach a class? And so what I did was I created a class where the students create, design, produce, and host a pilot episode for their own podcast. And what we do is we have a deal with the distribution company that my podcasts go under, and we put them out into the world, and they have something. And so at the end of the semester, the students actually have a podcast. They have something that they could send to a potential employer as opposed to a grade, something like that. So it's a really, really neat thing. I've taught sports media at Seton Hall. I've taught at St. John's. But this is it's a really fun project. Plus it's an excuse to drive up there. I live about 3.5 hours away. And so what I do is, every 2 or 3 weeks I go up there, and it's a chance to go home again. It's a lot of fun.
Professor Everett. I like it. I got, I think, 2 more questions, Seth. Who's your favorite broadcaster you've admired the most over the years, living or deceased?
Ooh, favorite broadcaster. My favorite broadcaster was a guy that I never met. Well, no, I'm going to change my answer. Favorite broadcaster is a guy I have met, and he's actually going to be on Sports with Friends in September. He asked me to reach out to him after the summer. Gary Thorne. Gary Thorne was the New York Mets announcer when I was growing up. I wasn't a Mets fan, but radio was the way you got sports media, and he called the 1986 World Series. And then in 1987, he got a job as the play-by-play voice of my beloved hockey team, the New Jersey Devils. Cool little nugget about the Devils and me. I moved to New Jersey the same day that the Devils franchise moved from Colorado. I was 8 years old, and my father took us to get ice cream. And he said, we saw a newspaper. It was the first time I saw a newspaper that didn't look like the Daily News, the New York Daily News. And the headline was, New Jersey's getting pro hockey today. And I was like, what's hockey? And, I had never seen it. And so I became a fan since literally minute one. And Gary Thorne was their announcer for, I think, their first 10 years. And he called the first time they ever made the playoffs. And I can remember the call. I could recite that call. I've gotten to work with some Hall of Famers. Working with Dave Niehaus was amazing. Rick Riz, Ron Fairley. Those guys are just amazing. I have a great friendship with Dave Sims.
Been on my show, great guy.
I've known Dave for decades now, and there's wonderful people. But for me, it was from growing up. Most people have their favorites from when they were growing up. And so, Gary Thorne, and I can't wait to have him on the podcast.
Well, can't wait to
I don't care if anybody hears it. It's just going to be self-serving for me.
Can't wait to hear him on Sports and Friends with you. Well, Seth, this will be probably my final question. I really appreciate you being very generous with your time. And
thanks for having me.
It's been a lot of fun. And my final question for you, what is in the future for Seth Everett?
What is what?
What is in the future for Seth Everett? Yeah.
Well, hopefully I finish editing in my immediate future. Right now I'm focused mostly on my family, my wife and my children, and their health and happiness. That's my future.
Great. Seth, thank you so much for doing this. Want to get you on for a while, and I really appreciate you coming to the 118th edition of the Sports Untold podcast.
118th. Oh, congrats.
Also, Rainier Avenue. Yeah, learning by doing, but I'm having a heck of a time. I call it my middle-aged diversion for my law practice. We're having a lot of fun doing this. So it's
right.
A lot of fun to have you on.
Well, I'll have to call you if Warner Brothers ever comes after me for the Hall of Justice. I'll say.
Well, yeah. Well,
Paul said it was okay.
Yes, yeah. you get what you pay for at legal advice sometimes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I had a great time.
Thanks for having me, man.
You too. Thanks.